The ICU alarm started screaming at 2:13 a.m. Not the soft notification nurses heard dozens of times each shift, not a sensor warning, not a battery alert. This one triggered the red protocol. Within seconds, lights flashed above the East Critical Care Wing of South Haven Medical Center. A nurse rushed from room 214. Another grabbed a portable monitor. A respiratory therapist was already moving down the corridor before anyone called her. Inside the room, a 9-year-old heart transplant patient lay sleeping, while 3 adults tried very hard not to look frightened. Because fear spreads. Especially in hospitals, especially around children. The pressure control system that protected the ICU environment had suddenly fallen out of compliance. For most people, that sentence meant nothing. For hospital staff, it meant everything. Airflow controlled infection risk. Pressure differences controlled contamination. If the system failed, patients had to move. And moving critically ill patients at 2 in the morning was never a small thing. By sunrise, the hospital's executive team had gathered in a conference room overlooking downtown Atlanta. Outside, cold rain streaked the windows. Inside, nobody touched the coffee. The estimate sat in the center of the table. 186,247. The number seemed almost unreal. According to the vendor, the entire pressure control assembly serving the East ICU wing required immediate replacement. The system was supposedly unstable. The sensors were supposedly degrading. The control modules were supposedly approaching failure. Replacement was the only responsible option. At least that was the official conclusion. Malcolm Price leaned back in his chair after finishing the presentation. He looked exactly like the kind of executive people trusted automatically. Perfect suit, perfect posture, perfect confidence. He was director of facilities operations, the man responsible for every major mechanical system inside the hospital. When Malcolm spoke, people usually stopped asking questions. Patient safety has to come first. Nobody argued. Then we move forward with replacement, he continued. 4 to 6 days of work. We can begin preparing patient transfers this afternoon. Several department heads reluctantly nodded. Dr. Naomi Carter stared at the estimate. Something bothered her. She couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the fact that everything had worked normally 3 days earlier. Maybe it was because problems that appeared overnight rarely required $200,000 to solve. She reached for her pen. And then a voice came from the doorway. Before you sign that, the room turned. A man stood beside a yellow cleaning cart. Rainwater dripped from the shoulders of his gray work jacket. His ID badge hung crooked. His boots were worn. Most people in the room knew him only as Elijah Barnes, night janitor, 58 years old, quiet, reliable, forgettable. The kind of employee people noticed only when something wasn't clean. Malcolm sighed immediately, not annoyed, embarrassed. The way executives get embarrassed when someone from the bottom of the organization accidentally wanders into a meeting. This is a restricted discussion, Elijah. The janitor didn't leave. Instead, he looked at the estimate, then at Malcolm, then at Dr. Carter. If you spend that money before opening the return vent behind room 214, he paused. You'll be having this same meeting again next week. The room went silent. Nobody knew what to do with that statement, especially because Elijah didn't sound uncertain. He sounded tired, like someone who had already solved the problem in his head hours ago. Malcolm stood. This is inappropriate. Elijah nodded once. Maybe. Then he pointed toward the estimate. But that's still the wrong repair. The silence deepened. Dr. Carter noticed something strange. Elijah wasn't looking at Malcolm. He wasn't trying to win an argument. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He looked like a man watching someone walk toward a hole in the ground, a hole he had warned them about years ago. And that realization bothered her, because people who bluff usually talk more. Elijah seemed interested in talking less. Malcolm stepped closer. You don't have access to the diagnostic reports. No. You haven't reviewed the vendor assessment. No. You aren't an HVAC engineer. The answer took half a second longer. No. Malcolm smiled. The smile of someone certain he had already won. Then explain how you know the diagnosis is wrong. For the first time, Elijah looked directly at him. The room felt smaller. Rain tapped against the glass. Far away, a siren passed somewhere downtown, and Elijah said something that changed everything. I trained the engineer who designed your assessment checklist. Nobody moved, not immediately. because people needed a moment to understand what they had just heard. Malcolm's smile disappeared. Dr. Carter lowered her pen. Someone near the back whispered, "What?" Elijah didn't elaborate, didn't boast, didn't explain. He simply reached into the pocket of his work jacket and pulled out a small black notebook. The cover was cracked. The corners were worn smooth. Years of use, years of carrying it, years of recording things nobody else thought mattered. He placed it gently on the conference table. Pressure logs. The words were handwritten, nothing fancy, nothing dramatic, just two ordinary words. Then Elijah looked at Malcolm. And for the first time all morning, the director of facilities operations looked nervous. Because both men remembered something nobody else in the room knew. 5 years earlier, before cancer, before budget cuts, before demotions, before funeral bills, before Elijah became the janitor everyone ignored, he had been Malcolm Price's supervisor. And the East ICU system they were arguing about, Elijah Barnes had helped build it. The rain continued falling outside, the estimate remained unsigned. And somewhere inside South Haven Medical Center, a $9 filter sat hidden behind room 214, waiting. Nobody spoke for almost 5 seconds. It wasn't a dramatic silence. It was the kind that appears when a room suddenly realizes there may be an entire story hiding beneath the version everyone thought they understood. Malcolm recovered first. People like Malcolm usually did. Years in management had taught him that confidence often mattered more than being right, at least in the first few minutes. He folded his arms. That was a long time ago. Elijah nodded. Yes, systems change. Sometimes standards change. They should. Malcolm pointed toward the estimate. But engineering doesn't happen from memory. Elijah looked at the black notebook. No. Then he placed one hand on it. It happens from records. Dr. Naomi Carter stood up. The movement surprised everyone, including Malcolm. Take me to room 214. The conference room immediately became uncomfortable, not because anyone objected, because Malcolm hesitated, only for a second. But long enough, and Naomi noticed. The group crossed 3 corridors and passed through a set of secured ICU doors. The atmosphere changed instantly. Hospitals always had invisible borders. The public side, and the side where every sound seemed softer because consequences were louder. Machines hummed, ventilators whispered, monitors blinked in darkened rooms. Nurses moved quickly without appearing rushed. Nobody wasted motion. Room 214 sat near the end of the east wing. The patient who had triggered the overnight transfer had already been relocated. The room stood empty now, cold, quiet, waiting. Elijah stopped beside a large return air grill mounted high on the wall. Most people would never look at it, which was precisely why he did. He pulled a small folding ladder from a nearby closet. The same ladder he had probably used hundreds of times before. The paint was chipped. One rubber foot was missing. A strip of gray tape wrapped around one hinge. Nothing about it looked important. Neither did Elijah. That was becoming a pattern. Malcolm sighed. This proves nothing. Elijah climbed 2 steps. No, then he removed the vent cover. This does. The room watched. Inside the housing sat a rectangular air filter. Ordinary, boring, forgettable. Exactly like thousands of others throughout the building. Elijah shined a flashlight across the frame. Then he frowned. A very small frown. The kind only people paying attention would notice. Naomi noticed. What is it? Elijah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid the filter out carefully, turned it over, examined the edges. Then handed it down. Naomi took it. The cardboard frame looked slightly warped. Not much, just enough. Most people would never notice. Malcolm immediately shook his head. That could have happened any time. Elijah nodded. True. Then he pointed to a stamp printed along the side. Manufacturing date, batch number, supplier code. Naomi looked closer. Elijah spoke quietly. That's the wrong filter. The room became still again. Malcolm laughed once, a short sound, almost relieved. You interrupted a 6-figure engineering decision over an air filter? No. Elijah looked at him. I interrupted it because that's not the filter this room was designed to use. The relief disappeared. 5 years earlier, during construction of the ICU expansion, Elijah had supervised airflow certification. Not because he was management. Because he was the best technician on the project. The rooms required a specialized low-flex return filter. Not expensive, not complicated, just different. A standard commercial filter would slowly bow under sustained airflow, not enough to fail. not enough to trigger inspection alarms, but enough to create unstable pressure readings. Exactly the kind of instability now appearing across the east wing. Malcolm crossed his arms tighter. That's a theory. Elijah looked toward Naomi. Can I show you? Naomi nodded. Show me. 20 minutes later, they stood inside the mechanical room beneath the ICU. The air was warmer here, louder. The building felt alive. Huge fans rotated overhead. Ductwork vibrated softly. Control cabinets blinked green and amber, the heartbeat of the hospital. Shanice Brooks arrived carrying a diagnostic tablet. 27 years old, biomedical systems engineer, 3 months into the job. Smart enough to know when she was standing near people who knew more than she did, and humble enough to listen. Elijah liked her immediately. Most young engineers wanted to prove things. Shanice wanted to understand them. He pointed toward a pressure monitoring port. Connect there. She did. Malcolm remained silent. Elijah removed the filter. Installed a correctly rated replacement from an old storage cabinet. A cabinet nobody had opened in years. Then he looked at Shanice. Read it. She stared at the screen. Her eyebrows rose. The pressure fluctuation immediately decreased, not completely, but significantly, a measurable improvement. Naomi stepped closer. What does that mean? Shanice swallowed. It means the filter is affecting system behavior. Malcolm answered before Elijah could. Affecting isn't causing, and that was the first twist. Because Malcolm was right, partially. The pressure readings improved, but they didn't stabilize. The alarms should have disappeared. They didn't. The room went quiet. Elijah stared at the data. Something bothered him, very badly. Not because his theory had failed, because it hadn't failed enough. The numbers were wrong in a different way now, a different pattern, a different rhythm. He looked toward the control cabinet, then toward the actuator assembly, then toward the sensor wiring, slowly, methodically. Like a hunter following tracks in fresh snow. Everyone waited, nobody interrupted. 5 minutes passed. Then Elijah walked to the rear side of the assembly, bent down, and stopped moving. Shanice noticed first. What is it? Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he reached behind the housing and pulled out a flashlight. The beam landed on a bundle of sensor wires. A plastic zip tie held them tightly against a support bracket. Too tightly, much too tightly. The room stared. Nobody understood yet, except Elijah. And maybe Malcolm. Elijah cut the zip tie. Nothing happened, at least not immediately. Then Shanice looked back at the monitor. The pressure graph changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. The fluctuations began smoothing. One spike disappeared, then another, then another. Like waves settling after a storm, nobody spoke. The only sound came from the fans overhead. Finally, Shanice whispered, "Oh my God." The graph stabilized, for the first time all day, inside tolerance, completely inside tolerance. The alarm disappeared. Dr. Naomi Carter stared at the screen. Then at Elijah, then back at the screen. The room suddenly felt much smaller, because they were no longer discussing a failing $186,000 system. They were discussing a wrong filter, a 5-cent zip tie, and a hospital wing that had nearly been shut down because nobody checked either one. But the biggest twist hadn't happened yet, because while everyone was looking at the monitor, Elijah was looking at Malcolm. And Malcolm wasn't looking at the monitor at all. He was looking at the cut zip tie, the way a man looks at something he recognizes, the way a man looks at evidence. And for the first time that day, Elijah became absolutely certain of something. Malcolm already knew. Elijah did not say what he was thinking. Not yet. That was one of the reasons he had survived nearly 3 decades inside large organizations. People revealed more when they believed they still controlled the story. The pressure alarm remained cleared. The graph remained stable. The ICU wing continued operating normally, and somehow that made the atmosphere worse, because now there was a new problem. The expensive explanation was disappearing. The simple explanation was becoming difficult to ignore. And simple explanations make certain people very uncomfortable, especially when money is involved. By late afternoon, word had already spread through parts of the hospital. Not officially. Hospitals communicate the same way small towns do, through hallways, through elevators, through half-finished conversations near coffee machines. The story changed every time it traveled. By 4 o'clock, some people were saying a janitor had fixed a 6-figure system failure. By 5 o'clock, others were saying the vendor had made a mistake. Neither version was entirely true, But both versions were dangerous, because they invited questions. Questions Malcolm Price desperately wanted to avoid. The emergency review meeting began at 6:30 p.m. Rain still tapped softly against the conference room windows. The city lights outside reflected across the glass like scattered stars. Dr. Naomi Carter sat at the head of the table. To her left sat Leonard Hayes from Compliance. To her right sat Shanice Brooks with a laptop and 3 printed diagnostic reports. Malcolm arrived carrying a thick presentation binder, nearly 2 inches thick, the kind of binder designed to communicate authority before anyone opened it. Elijah arrived carrying only his black notebook and Denise's old flashlight. The flashlight had belonged to his wife for years. She used it during power outages, camping trips, storms. The batteries had been replaced countless times. The scratches on the handle had not. For reasons Elijah couldn't explain, carrying it tonight made him feel less alone. The meeting began exactly how Malcolm wanted. He controlled the first 20 minutes. Slides, charts, vendor documentation, technical language, industry standards, risk assessments, regulatory exposure. Everything sounded impressive. Everything sounded reasonable. And if someone walked into the room halfway through the presentation, they would probably assume Malcolm was winning. Because expertise often sounds convincing, even when it's wrong, especially when it's wrong. Finally, Malcolm reached his conclusion. The temporary stabilization observed today does not eliminate the possibility of underlying degradation. He clicked to the final slide. Therefore, replacement remains the safest course of action. Silence followed. Malcolm sat down, satisfied. Then Naomi looked at Elijah. Your turn. Elijah stood. No slides, no binder, no presentation, just the notebook and the flashlight. The contrast was almost uncomfortable. He walked to the center of the room, placed the flashlight on the conference table, then opened the notebook. The first page wasn't technical. It wasn't even recent. It was dated 5 years earlier, the year the ICU wing opened. Elijah looked around the room, then began speaking. When this wing was built, we spent 3 months testing airflow. Nobody interrupted. The final certification took 6 attempts. Shanice looked surprised. The official record showed 2. Not 6, Elijah continued. The first 4 failed. Now everyone was listening. The sensors kept reporting instability. He turned a page. We eventually discovered a supplier had shipped the wrong filter frames. Another page. The readings immediately stabilized after replacement. Another page. The issue was documented. He stopped, looked directly at Malcolm. The report was sent to facilities operations. The room became very quiet. Malcolm remained expressionless. Too expressionless. That bothered Naomi, because innocent people usually react. Anger, confusion, disagreement, something. Malcolm seemed busy calculating. Elijah closed the notebook. That's when I knew today's failure looked familiar. Leonard Hayes leaned forward. Do we still have that report? Elijah nodded. Probably. Malcolm answered immediately. Construction archives were destroyed years ago. The answer came too quickly. Everyone noticed, including Leonard, including Naomi, including Shanice, most importantly, including Elijah. For the first time all evening, Malcolm appeared worried, not about the repair, not about the ICU, about paperwork, and paperwork leaves trails. At 7:18 p.m., Shanice found the archived construction server. At 7:26 p.m., she found the report. At 7:31 p.m., the room stopped feeling like a meeting and started feeling like an investigation. The report existed. Exactly where Elijah said it would, exactly as he described. Wrong filter specification, pressure instability, false system alarms, corrective action, problem resolved. Everyone looked at Malcolm. He looked at the table, then at the report, then at Naomi. His answer came carefully. That doesn't prove I remembered it. A reasonable defense, maybe even a good one, for about 30 seconds. Then Shanice spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it changed everything, actually. Everyone turned. She swallowed, then rotated her laptop toward the room. I found something else. The screen displayed a procurement record, a routine supply order, nothing dramatic at first. The order date was 6 weeks earlier. 3 pallets of standard commercial filters, approved by facilities operations, approved by Malcolm Price. The room remained silent. Shanice continued. The old ICU-specific filters cost $14 each. Nobody spoke. The standard replacements cost $9 or $5. That was the difference. $5 per filter. The number sounded ridiculous until she kept talking. There are over 1,100 filter locations in this hospital. Now people started doing math. $5 multiplied by 1,100. Repeated multiple times per year, across multiple years, not fraud, not millions. But enough money for someone in purchasing to justify standardization. Enough money for someone to decide the difference didn't matter. Enough money for someone to stop listening. Elijah already knew where the conversation was going, but he wasn't prepared for what came next. Because Shanice wasn't finished. She clicked again. Another document appeared, then another, then another. The room slowly realized they weren't looking at one purchase order. They were looking at a pattern. 3 years, 7 separate approvals. Every single one signed by Malcolm Price. The same filter substitutions, the same cost-saving justifications, the same documentation language. Naomi looked stunned. Leonard Hayes stopped taking notes. Even Malcolm seemed caught off guard, because this wasn't the evidence he expected. He had prepared for technical arguments, not administrative archaeology. Then came the biggest twist of the night. Shanice opened one final file. The room fell silent. The document title read, Employee Reclassification Recommendation. Date 3 years earlier. Employee name Elijah Barnes. The room suddenly felt colder. Naomi looked toward Elijah. He hadn't seen the document before. That much was obvious. Shanice continued reading. The recommendation proposed eliminating the senior HVAC technical supervisor position, budget optimization, operational restructuring, role consolidation, corporate language, cold language. The language organizations use when they don't want paperwork to sound personal. At the bottom sat a signature, Malcolm Price. The room froze. Now the story looked different, much different, because suddenly Malcolm hadn't merely ignored a warning. He had signed off on replacing the very person most likely to challenge those decisions. No one spoke, not for several seconds. Then Naomi asked the question, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly enough that everyone heard every word. Did you demote the one person who knew these systems best? Malcolm finally lost his composure, only slightly, only for a moment. But enough. That's not what happened. The answer came too quickly, again. And when people answer too quickly, they often reveal more than they intend. Elijah sat silently, watching, listening, the way he always had. Because the truth was finally doing what truth eventually does. Not exploding, not announcing itself, not demanding attention, simply connecting one fact to another. Then another, until the picture became impossible to ignore. The meeting ended without a final decision. But nobody cared about the filter anymore. Nobody cared about the zip tie. Nobody cared about the actuator assembly. Those questions had already been answered. A much larger question now hung over the hospital, and everyone knew it. When Malcolm stood to leave, he gathered his binder more slowly than before. The confidence was gone. The certainty was gone. The room that had belonged to him 6 hours earlier no longer did. As he reached the doorway, he stopped, looked back at Elijah, and asked a question that sounded almost accidental. Almost. Did you keep copies of everything? Elijah looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Most things. The color drained slightly from Malcolm's face, only slightly, but enough, because in that moment Elijah finally understood something. The report wasn't the thing Malcolm feared. The filters weren't the thing Malcolm feared. The ICU wasn't the thing Malcolm feared. There was something else, something older, something buried much deeper than a maintenance decision. And whatever it was, Malcolm thought Elijah still had the evidence. Elijah Barnes did not sleep that night, not because he was worried. Worry had long ago stopped keeping him awake. Life had already given him harder things than administrative investigations. Cancer had done that. Hospital rooms had done that. Watching Denise grow weaker while pretending she wasn't had done that. No, what kept him awake was curiosity. Because for the first time in years, he thought he finally understood why Malcolm Price looked afraid. And it wasn't about the filters. At 4:47, Elijah sat alone at his kitchen table. The blue coffee mug sat beside him, cold, untouched. A light rain tapped softly against the apartment window. Atlanta was still mostly asleep. He opened an old cardboard storage box that had remained untouched beneath his bed for years. Inside were notebooks, service records, maintenance drawings, training materials. Thousands of pages from a career most people assumed had ended. Near the bottom sat a faded manila folder. The label had almost worn away. East ICU expansion. Elijah stared at it. A strange feeling settled over him. Not excitement, recognition. The feeling people get when they suddenly remember where they left something important years ago. He opened the folder. The answer appeared less than 30 seconds later. At 5:12 a.m., Elijah stopped breathing for a moment. Then he sat back in his chair and whispered no. Not because he had discovered something shocking, because he had discovered something worse, something logical, something documented, something real. The most dangerous kind of truth. Across town, Malcolm Price was already awake. He had slept barely 2 hours. The investigation had started moving faster than expected. Too many records, too many questions. Too many people suddenly interested in details they had ignored for years. At 7:30 a.m., he entered his office carrying a travel coffee cup and immediately froze. A calendar invitation waited in his inbox. Emergency Executive Review. 9 a.m. Mandatory attendance. Participants: Naomi Carter, Compliance, Legal, Procurement, Facilities, Shanit Brooks Xol, and Elijah Barnes. Malcolm closed his eyes. Only briefly, but long enough, because he already knew whatever Elijah had found. It was serious. The meeting began exactly at 9. No presentations, no slides, no vendor representatives. The atmosphere felt completely different. This wasn't a discussion anymore, it was an examination. Naomi sat quietly at the head of the table. Several folders rested in front of her. Leonard Hayes from Compliance sat beside her. 3 attorneys occupied the far side. Nobody smiled, nobody made small talk. The room had moved beyond that stage. Malcolm arrived last. Elijah arrived second to last, still wearing the same gray maintenance jacket, still carrying the same notebook, still carrying Denise's flashlight. The contrast somehow felt even stronger now. Naomi began. Mr. Barnes found additional records. The room turned toward Elijah. He stood slowly, opened the manila folder, then removed a single document, 1 page, just one. No dramatic reveal, no speech, no performance. He simply handed copies around the table. People began reading. 30 seconds passed, then 60, then 90. No one spoke, because they were reading the original equipment approval package for the East ICU expansion. Specifically, the filter specification section. The signature page sat at the bottom. Approved by Technical Supervisor Elijah Barnes. Approved by Facilities Director Richard Holloway. Approved by Construction Engineering Consultant. Everything looked normal, until page 7. Shanice found it first. Her eyes widened. Then Naomi found it. Then Legal. Then Compliance. The room slowly realized what they were looking at. The ICU filter system had never been approved for standard commercial replacements, ever. The specifications explicitly prohibited them. Not recommended, not suggested, prohibited. The reason was listed clearly: pressure stability requirements. Exactly the issue causing the current crisis. Leonard looked toward Malcolm. When did you first see this document? Malcolm hesitated. Too long, and everyone noticed again. Then Elijah opened the folder a second time. More documents emerged: maintenance requests, inspection reports, internal recommendations, email chains, a paper trail stretching back almost 6 years. Every warning pointed to the same issue. Every warning had been acknowledged. Every warning had eventually disappeared. The pattern became impossible to ignore. But the final piece arrived from somewhere nobody expected: procurement. One of the attorneys opened another folder, a folder Elijah had never seen. A folder Malcolm had hoped nobody would find. Inside sat records from a vendor incentive program. Perfectly legal, at least on paper. Annual purchasing bonuses, performance incentives, cost reduction awards. Nothing criminal, nothing dramatic, until the numbers were compared. Each year the hospital reduced supply costs through approved substitutions. Management personnel qualified for bonus evaluations, including facilities operations, including Malcolm Price. The room became completely silent, not because anyone had discovered corruption, because reality was more believable than corruption, more human, more dangerous. Malcolm hadn't been stealing, he hadn't been running a scam, he hadn't planned to endanger patients. He had simply convinced himself that small shortcuts didn't matter. $5 here, $7 there, one substitution, one approval, one exception. year after year, decision after decision, until eventually the shortcuts became policy, and the people who disagreed became inconvenient, including Elijah. The realization hit harder than any villain reveal ever could, because everyone in the room recognized it. This wasn't the story of an evil man. It was the story of an intelligent man who stopped listening and slowly built a system that rewarded agreement over truth. Naomi finally broke the silence. Did you know the substitutions violated the original specifications? Malcolm stared at the documents. The fight was gone now, the confidence, the certainty, the authority, gone. For several seconds, nobody heard anything except the air conditioning system quietly moving overhead, the same system that had started everything. Finally, Malcolm answered. And for the first time since the story began, he told the truth. At first, his voice sounded older. I thought it didn't matter. Nobody moved. The savings looked reasonable. Another pause. I thought Elijah was being difficult. Elijah said nothing. I thought experience was making him resistant to change. The room remained silent. Malcolm laughed once, a sad sound, not a happy one. Then he looked directly at Elijah, the first honest look in years. You kept warning us. Elijah nodded, yes. I stopped listening. Another nod, yes. The room sat in silence, no speeches, no shouting, no dramatic confession. Just the uncomfortable weight of reality. The investigation formally concluded 3 weeks later. The findings were straightforward. The ICU replacement was unnecessary. The pressure failure originated from specification violations and maintenance shortcuts. The hospital adopted new review procedures. All critical infrastructure modifications now required dual technical approval. Field technicians were granted direct reporting authority for safety concerns. No manager could suppress a technical warning without independent review. Malcolm Price resigned before the final report was released. Not fired, resigned. His letter was 2 paragraphs long. The hospital never published it. Elijah never asked to read it. Some stories do not need every page. 3 months later, South Haven Medical Center created a new position, Senior Infrastructure Reliability Advisor. The title sounded complicated. The job was simple. Listen before something breaks. Elijah accepted, mostly because Shanice refused to stop asking, mostly because Naomi insisted, mostly because Denise would have laughed at the idea of him retiring anyway. The first day in the new role, Elijah walked through the East ICU wing. Room 214 stood quietly at the end of the corridor. A nurse waved. A patient slept peacefully. The pressure monitors remained perfectly stable. No alarms, no flashing lights, no emergencies, just ordinary life, which was exactly the goal. That evening, Elijah drove to the cemetery. The sun was setting. Orange light moved through the trees. The grass shifted softly in the wind. He sat beside Denise's headstone and placed the old flashlight next to him. For a long time he said nothing. Then he smiled. Very slightly. The way people smile when speaking to someone they still miss. They finally checked the filter. The breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, children were laughing. Elijah sat quietly for another minute, then stood, picked up the flashlight, and walked back toward his truck, because the best endings rarely feel like endings. Most of the time they feel like another ordinary day, just a little lighter than the one before. Personal note disclaimer. This story is fictional, but the lesson behind it is real. Most major failures in organizations do not begin with evil intentions. They begin when people stop listening to those closest to the work. Whether in hospitals, engineering, manufacturing, education, or business, expertise is not determined by job title alone. Sometimes the person with the most valuable knowledge is the one nobody thinks to ask. The purpose of this story is not to criticize leadership or expertise. It is to remind us that humility, careful observation, and respect for people at every level often prevent problems long before technology, money, or authority can solve them. The end.